This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran.
The Assad government has fallen. Everyone knows this. But what people may not know are the underlying geopolitical events which caused it and the spiritual reality which underpins all of this. Brother Tahir, why don't you take us through what's happened recently?
Yeah, so on the day of the ceasefire between Lebanon and Israel, fighters from Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is a previous kind of al-Nusra front, which was an Al-Qaeda affiliated group, who are held up in Idlib, had been for several years and had been running Idlib pretty much.
Right.
They made moves on Aleppo, and from Aleppo they moved on to Hama and Homs and then Damascus.
Yeah.
And over that several week period, and maybe 2 to 3 weeks, I think it is, they were bombed a few times by the Russians. Even less than that. I know, it was definitely 2 at least, I think. They were bombed a few times by the Russians on behalf of the Syrians, but the Syrian army put up very little, if any, resistance.
Yeah.
And then what they did is that we found out that Bashar al-Assad had fled the country, has been residing in Moscow, recently given asylum there with his family. And the prime minister of the previous Bashar al-Assad government has now promised a steady transition to a new government. Now, what that new government will look like, whether it will be these kinds of repackaged Al-Qaeda fighters, or whether it be a different Syrian national unity government, God only knows. But the general trend we see across the world when it comes to rebel insurgencies overthrowing
Muslim
governments or even dictatorships is you often have a severe worsening of the situation in the country prior to any form of stability.
And I think, we could do a blow-by-blow account of what's happened, but actually I think it's more helpful to look at the wider trends of what's happening in the Muslim world in particular, because this is not the first country to have an insurgency, a rebellion which overtook it, and it's not the first country which has had a lot of foreign entities working within it and trying to influence it and influence it towards their own ends. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the historical roots of both the current conflict, but actually the civil war as a whole over the last 10, 12 years?
Well, that's a pretty tough ask. Thanks very much for putting me in the hot seat like
Anytime.
That's really appreciated. I think you have to understand Syria in terms of its literal geographic reality. It is a Mediterranean country which sits abutting Iraq, sits abutting Lebanon, Israel as well, and Turkey. And so it's a nation which sits kind of at the east-west axis, a bit like Turkey in that sense as well. And it forms a natural land bridge via Turkey into Europe from the Gulf states. And understanding that is kind of at the root of the fact that there have been a lot of players who are very interested in Syria's geopolitical choices. Turkey always wants to get in and has been seeking to kind of coerce or persuade strongly Assad into supporting Turkish interests. And then obviously you have Israel occupying the Golan Heights in the south portion of Syria. And then obviously you have the very oil-rich regions of Syria to the eastern parts of it. So it's a very complex, multifaceted aspect. But basically, I think the key point to take home is that there's a lot of people who feel like they should have a piece of Syria, or that Syria should follow their dictates in how they choose their foreign and domestic policy.
Right, and also the demographics are interesting because it has been ruled historically for many decades now by a Shia minority, or a group amongst the Shia minority, while being a Sunni majority country. And it has been seen to be a part of the axis of resistance of the Shia countries against Israeli and Western interests. So you have the Hezbollah, you have Iran, and you have Syria. And Syria has been a key part of supporting, it is said, through arms, Hezbollah, and being part of rearming it. So it's a place of real interest. But what I want to talk about is that even before the civil war kicked off, a deal was attempted to be struck with Syria, was it not? And can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there was a Qatari Syria-Turkey gas pipeline project. This is an article you'll see on your screen now, December 10th, 2024. This actually only came out a few days ago, therefore, and it's saying, is it possible after Assad's fall, the gas pipeline? And this gas pipeline, as you can see on this particular image, it would run from Qatar, it would run up through Saudi, through Jordan, and then through Syria and into Turkey and into Europe. And the significance of that is that typically it is Russia who has had, I think, about 30% of Europe's gas comes, or Europe's energy perhaps, comes from Russian gas.
Yeah.
And so this would effectively free up Europe from dependency on Russian gas.
So where would that gas come from?
So that gas would come from Qatar, but it would need to pass through Syria to achieve. And in 2009, Bashar al-Assad, who's typically and historically the Syrians have been closely allied with the Russians, said no to that deal.
Yeah.
And then only 2 years later, you had the Syrian civil war kickoff, which we now know was a well-known statement, which was that Obama signed a directive to the CIA to overthrow Bashar al-Assad.
Was that Operation Timber Sycamore?
That's correct, yeah, Timber Sycamore.
And for instance, we have in WikiLeaks, we have a statement by Jake Sullivan where he said something very
Who is Jake Sullivan? He's the National Security Advisor to the United States Biden administration.
That role, especially at that time. But he was high up in the sort of intelligence community and in the Secretary of State kind of, in the State Department, I think.
Yeah.
So a high up State Department official. And he was saying, he was talking about the different players that are in Syria at that time, because there was an uprising, and the exact details are contested and potentially murky. How much of it was a genuine, true uprising against the rule of the Assad dynasty? How much of it was supported and abetted by foreign powers such as America?
Likely multifaceted, likely both.
Yeah. And to reduce it to one or the other is very likely to be the mistake.
It's a misrepresentation. Yeah. I think undoubtedly there was, I mean, as you can see from all the prisoners who've been held up in Assad's prisons, obviously there's been intergenerational at times crimes being committed against their population without a doubt. But at the same time, the United States and other countries, Western powers, use that to fan the flames to promote the civil war further. And this particular, the WikiLeaks you're referring to, I've got up on my screen now. So this is Jacob Sullivan, writing an email that says, see last item, AQ, Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. This is 2012, February 12th. Otherwise, things have basically turned out as expected. So this shows that there was a clear and easy, I mean, it's kind of nonchalantly written, isn't it?
Yeah.
They're on our side in Syria. So,
and the Americans were supplying a lot of arms and money to militant groups in Syria to fight the government.
That was the famous article, wasn't it, by what's his name?
Was it Robert Fisk?
No,
it was Seymour Hersh.
It was Seymour Hersh. The Rat Line.
Yeah.
The Rat Line, how weapons from Libya and the Libyan crisis were being taken and being transported up through into Syria for use by insurgents.
And it developed into this kind of insane war, to be honest, where you have a proxy war being fought because Russia eventually came in, to the surprise of many. Russia came in, then you had America versus Russia through proxies on the ground, and then through them directly, at least with Russians on the ground. While you had ISIS, some people said this was clearly an adjacent group to ones that America was funding, and they seemed to be this three-way clash between the different forces. So it was very complex. Ultimately, the government of Syria and Russia seemed to win, and seemed to have successfully seen off the American influence and the uprising. But actually, a third of their country remained occupied by America. The oil fields of America
are still to this day occupied by the United States.
So, I mean, to what extent that was truly a victory is very contested. But I think what I'm interested in particular is that not just this conflict, but we have a wider trend of all of these countries in the Middle East being destroyed, ultimately, be it by direct, American invasion, or be it through some kind of uprising which was taken advantage of. We've had multiple countries taken out. There was that famous video, which I think everyone has seen, of Wesley Clark,
General
Wesley Clark, where he said after 9/11 there was a plan. He was given a plan literally, I think, weeks after, or days to weeks after.
It was days after, I think.
Where he was told, there's a plan to take out Iraq, and he said
7 countries in 5 years.
7 countries in 5 years. Actually, I think I've got the countries. So the countries were Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran.
This isn't anything new, though, in a sense.
Right.
I think this is a more popularized version of something that was highlighted by Jeffrey Sachs on a recent interview with Piers Morgan.
Which is where does that kind of plan come from, right? Because we now see 20 years later, okay, they weren't taken out in 5 years.
That was hubris.
But pretty much all of those countries, apart from Iran, have seen either complete destruction or major turmoil.
Yeah.
So why those countries, and where does this plan come from?
And it's not through not wanting to get Iran.
Yeah. Exactly.
There's been a lot of pressure to try and take Iran out.
Yeah.
I mean, so there is the only source I can find, and this is mentioned by Jeffrey Sachs, who's a very well respected economist and geopolitical commentator now.
Yeah.
On Piers Morgan within the last 1.5 weeks, I think. So he referenced this book, Fighting Terrorism, How Democracies Can Defeat Domestic and Internal Terrorists by editor Benjamin Netanyahu in 1995, 1996. And he writes in this book, the whole book is basically about, so-called, what he describes as terrorism, which when you read even a little bit, you come to realize is basically anybody who's against his geopolitical interests and the geopolitical interests of Israel immediately gets branded as a terrorist.
Yes.
And he writes in this...
Things have changed hugely since...
Things have changed hugely, completely. Now they're anti-Semites as well. So the in this particular section called Expedient Intermediaries, he says, I do not believe that we can effectively contain international terrorism without adopting effective countermeasures against the terrorist states. Do we have this up on the screen? Very good. That provide the training, arms, finance, propaganda, backup, sanctuaries, and in some notable instances, strategic guidance, blah, blah, blah. He says the states that provide official backing for international terrorism, this is his official list of international terrorists, states that provide official international terrorism.
Well, he has some expertise in the area. So.
Yeah, well, exactly. He says, A, the Soviet bloc countries, specifically Cuba and North Vietnam. B, the radical Arab states. Libya, Syria, Iraq, South Yemen, I don't know what happened to North Yemen, Algeria, and C, Iran. At least he had the awareness that Iran is not an Arab state.
Yeah.
There is a powerful lobby that is calling for the most dangerous imaginable new addition, an independent Palestinian Arab state. He then goes on to say, so that's really interesting. He was clearly against the two-state solution back in the mid-90s.
Yeah.
And yet everybody's always saying, oh no, Netanyahu's just changed his view. He hasn't changed his view. His view's been the same for about 30 years now, okay, if not his entire life. He then goes on to say that the Russians have an obvious and compelling interest in using any instrument that can help to weaken the NATO alliance and erode the fabric of the Western democracies. Terrorism has its place in the long-term Soviet strategy for overcoming the West, along with subversion and disinformation. The breakneck expansion of the Russian war machine and the systematic attempt to deprive the West of automatic access to its major sources of energy in the
Translate that for us.
Listen to this. He says Russia is against the systematic attempt to deprive the West of automatic access to its own major sources of energy in the Gulf.
Okay, I don't understand that.
And of strategic raw materials in Central and Southern Africa. The way he phrases it is interesting. First of all, he's saying that Russia is, along with these other countries, also a source of international terrorism.
Okay.
This is pre-Soviet. This is just after the Soviet breakup, right? This is 95. But then the way he puts it is very interesting. He says, the systematic attempt to deprive the West. He's saying that there's some systematic
attempt to deprive the West.
To deprive the West of its automatic access to its major sources of energy.
Just colonialism built in
the Gulf.
They're rulers of the world. And they have a right to everyone's resources.
And of strategic raw materials in Central and Southern Africa. I mean, nobody ever talks about
Central and Southern Africa.
Nobody ever talks about what's happening in Central Africa. It's an invisible war. It's called the Hidden War, right? No, it doesn't make it on our news what happens in the Congo. Huge country. It's got 3 time zones. Absolutely enormous.
Yes.
Nobody ever talks about it, right? Sometimes it blips up on a Joe Rogan podcast about artisanal mining and for cobalt for your solar panels. Apart from that, it's completely invisible. But here he's talking about it, and he puts it as up there along with the opportunity, how dare the West be denied its automatic access to its own sources of energy in the Gulf.
Yeah.
And I think this ties in very, very neatly.
Well, it's actually a pitch. If you think about it, he's pitching to the West so clearly because he knows that Israel is dependent on them. So he is completely enamored, and he's also completely beholden to a pro-Western narrative of saying that yes, these are your resources that you are entitled to them. Just take out our enemies in the neighborhood, and you will get the resources which are yours.
Yeah.
So this is something we've spoken about at length on our channel, which is about the coalescing of the Zionist interests, be they Israeli Zionists or be they the Christian Zionists in the West. All of it kind of comes out of this hubris of world domination, that we are the masters of the universe and that the world ultimately belongs to us, and anyone who opposes us must go. And this is exactly what's happened. Anyone who stood up against the West, and this isn't to say that we support all of their domestic policies of Saddam or even international policies of Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi, etc., but anyone who supported the West ended up being deposed. And we've seen that, anyone who opposed the West ended up being deposed. And again, we've now seen that with Assad.